Right, we're up Vegas. How are you guys doing this morning? What's that? My name is Jeff Whelpley. I'm the chief architect at Get Human, and I'm just curious, how many people out there love Angular? Let me get a hoo-ah on three. 1, 2, 3. All right. Now, there are good reasons why all of us love Angular. And there are good, legitimate reasons why some other developers might not like it as much. Today, I'm going to focus on the common criticisms of Angular and try to separate out myth from reality. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, Jeff, who would ever criticize Angular? And believe it or not, it happens a lot. And I don't know about you, but I am fascinated by this type of stuff. I read it all the time. I just enjoy seeing critical analysis of something I know really well. And I've written a couple popular blog posts about it. The first one about why developers love Angular, and the second one about why some other developers hate Angular. And what I found is that you could pretty much boil every single anti-Angular post down to 4 primary areas of criticism: performance, learning curve, ability to reason, and rendering. So I'm going to dive into each one of these and start separating out the myth from reality. So the first one is Angular is slow. So just as an example, we have a nested ng repeat with 2 bindings. And let's just say that getTitle takes 1 millisecond to run. And we have 100 users and 10 skills. Now, how long do you think that this will take to do the initial render? If you said 1 second, you'd be wrong. It's 3 seconds. Because Angular sometimes has to run the digest cycle multiple times in order to account for two-way data binding and other edge cases. And then on subsequent runs, it does do some optimizations and gets it down to about 1 second. But still, every digest cycle, every turn of the Angular event loop, there's still this 1 second lag. And someone from the outside who looks at this uses this as evidence A that Angular is slow. But then I'm looking at my boy, Lucas, over there, who's giving me a look like, what are you talking about? Just getTitle is the problem. You can just optimize that and then problem solved. Or if for some reason you can't optimize that function, you could always pre-compute all of the titles and then just bind to primitives, which, again, problem solved. And this is the real crux of the problem, that there are pitfalls within Angular where you can have performance issues, but they're easy to avoid once you understand the digest cycle. So really, it's about learning, which is the second area of criticism. Angular is hard to learn. Now, when we start off and we're just dealing with HTML and plain JavaScript, it's easy, right? I mean, that's where we all get started. Angular is magical. But then we try to write our own first custom directive, and it gets complex really quick. The thing is that there is no doubt a learning curve within Angular. Actually, there's many learning curves, and it looks like this, where you can get started quickly and easily, but then when you try to make your app something real, there's a bit of a learning curve to get past, and then maybe it doesn't run as fast, and you have to learn the digest cycle, and there's another learning curve, and it kind of keeps going like that in an iterative fashion, right? And it's this type of learning curve that allowed this guy, Jeff Goodman, an accountant with no technical training, formal technical training, to build this site, Plunker, one of the most popular websites out there for sharing code. What Jeff talked about at ngconf was that Angular's low barrier to entry is one of the keys to his success. And yeah, he ran into issues. He ran into the learning curve, right? But that's where the community came in. The Angular community is awesome. Just like Frosty talked about earlier, there are people in the Angular community who want to help you succeed. There's a culture of helping one another and mutual respect. And there's a lot of content that's been produced over the past 5 years to help you pass those learning curves. For example, here are a couple GitHub repos that I like that have tons of links for both Angular 1 and Angular 2. There's also style guides. I love egghead.io for a lot of video tutorials. There's just a lot of content out there. So as far as learning Angular goes, there are a lot of ways to get past that learning curve. The thing that the community can't help as much with, though, are issues that occur in the apps that you build on top of Angular that are specific to your app. And that's where the third area of criticism comes in, that Angular is hard to reason. So what does this mean? Let's take a simple input box with ng model, two-way data binding. And let's pick it up a notch and add three-way data binding with Firebase. Now, it is awesome what you can do with just a very small amount of code. I mean, the stuff Yuri talked about with Meteor also is really cool. But when you do just a basic three-way data binding without any filtering or anything like that, it's great for prototyping and small apps. But once you start building a much larger app and it adds complexity, this causes more problems than it solves. You end up having to break this down, add different security concerns, different things for user experience, for data integrity. So in Angular, it is true that sometimes the stuff that makes it easy to get started makes stuff harder later on if you don't adjust. And that's where stuff like my boy Matthias wrote an article for on AirPair about component-based Angular directives. And if you can build your Angular 1 app with components, it does help a great deal to make it easier to reason when they get larger. So that means not using ng controller, not using scope or two-way data binding, using directives as components, and trying to create some sort of one-way data flow. Now, if you do these things, it is possible. People do create large apps within Angular that are easy to reason. It is possible. What is not possible within Angular core is rendering outside the browser. And this is the fourth area of criticism, that Angular is not isomorphic. Yuri talked about earlier that you can use something like Angular Meteor to render Angular code on the server, but that's not part of the core, right? That's not exactly the same. With Angular, there's no server rendering, there's no mobile rendering, there's no canvas rendering, and that's just sad. But as I talked about at ngconf this year, it is possible to create something outside of Angular like Yuri has done. I've also created my own engine on the server that can run Angular code. But it's not ideal. It's not something that I feel suits everyone. The ideal solution is something that is built into the core of the framework. And that's something that probably will not happen in Angular 1. But what about Angular 2? So far, I've only talked about Angular 1. And how does Angular 2 stack up to all of these criticisms? Before we get to that, let's do a quick recap. So instead of saying Angular is slow, what we really should be saying is an app built with Angular 1 can be slow if you have an inefficient expression. And like I talked about, most of the time it's pretty easy to avoid if you understand the digest cycle. Instead of Angular is hard to learn, we should be saying that Angular 1 can be hard to learn at times, but it's easy to get started, and there are many resources available online to help. Instead of Angular is hard to reason, large apps built with Angular can be hard to reason if you don't use component-driven design and follow best practices. And finally, Angular can't render outside the browser is sort of true as far as the Angular 1 core code goes. You have to use something outside of Angular. Now, how does Angular 2 stack up to all of these? So for performance, right out of the box, Angular 2 is fast, ultra fast, trademark pending. But you can get, with Angular 1, there used to be a while ago this thing about 20,000 bindings was the limit, that if you went above 20,000 bindings, then the performance of your app was going to degrade. And they've improved it since then. But with Angular 2, you can have hundreds of thousands of bindings that only take a couple milliseconds, and that's, I mean, amazing. But sometimes you need even faster than that, and in that case, you can, in Angular 2, use immutable data objects like they talked about yesterday, or observables to sometimes skip the digest cycle altogether and make things even faster. So as far as performance goes, Angular 2 definitely checks. As far as learning curve, in Angular 2, yeah, for the people who were part of the workshop before this conference, they probably agree that it's like drinking from a fire hose initially. But there are a lot of things within Angular 2 that make us believe that it's going to be a lot easier to learn in the long run. First of all, there's a lot of simplified concepts. I have here as an example that there are dozens of directives that just are not needed anymore because of the new binding syntax, or binding semantics, rather. And that's just within Angular core. There are many more in the community that just aren't needed anymore. Also, if you look at this example of just a simple component, and it has an if within the template. Now, in order to use that if, you have to import it and then declare it as a directive. Most of the people who get started with Angular 2, the first thing that comes to their mind is, why do I have to declare this all over the place? I have to write if 3 times in order to use it, right? But this actually helps a great deal in everybody's ability to learn and makes Angular a stronger language because the IDEs can key off this and understand what your app is doing. So in the future, it's not quite there yet. The tooling is not quite there yet. But when you combine the explicitness of Angular 2 with TypeScript types, a reality is going to be having something like, for those .NET developers out there, something like ReSharper for JavaScript, which is just mind-blowing. And for those of you that have used ReSharper, you know that it like writes code for you practically. And we're going to have that with Angular eventually. You also notice that a lot of the Angular code is in annotations, whereas outside of those annotations, it's essentially just plain ES6. So learning Angular 2, a large part of it is just learning ES6, which is easier because there's a lot more resources, it's a lot more common. So I think learning curve is definitely going to be easier. And as far as ability to reason, the problem in Angular 1 is that there's no guarantee, both at the component level and the data level, of how things work because there's cycles. So in this case, you aren't guaranteed that the parent is going to update before the child element. And when you have data that's globally bound, like we talked about earlier, you don't necessarily know how everything's going to update, the sequence of it. But in Angular 2, everything is a directed acyclic graph, a tree. You know that it's always going to be the parent updating and then the child. You know that data is explicitly passed from the parent to the child and isolated. That makes it extremely easier to understand and to reason. And so it's going to be a lot easier to build much larger apps with Angular 2. And finally, for rendering, the architecture within Angular is built such that it separates out the application layer from the rendering layer. So all the code that you write in Angular 2 lives in this application level, right? And the stuff that talks to the DOM and reads from the DOM is in the rendering layer below. So what that means is you can take your same application code and switch out the rendering layer to do rendering on wherever you want, native, server, whatever. And there are teams working on this. The architecture is in Angular Alpha right now. There's not any of the other rendering engines outside of the browser DOM right now, but there are teams working on native. They just came out today or yesterday, NativeScript 1.0, that has the initial prototype for using Angular 2. And also for server rendering, that's something that Patrick Stapleton, who's going to be talking a little bit later this morning, and I are working with Tobias from the core team. And we are making a lot of great progress. We have an update at Angular U next month in June. So stay tuned for that. But the one thing I will say is that server rendering will be baked into Angular 2 at some point. So really we have all the common criticisms are addressed with Angular 2. So it's just a matter of updating to Angular 2 and call it a day, right? Well, this is where the fifth major criticism of Angular comes in that more recently has started coming up, that there is no migration path to 2.0. And this is something that really causes consternation. I mean, people really are freaking out, getting really mad about the idea that they have to throw away all their code and just start again. So let's take a breath and then talk about migration path. And I think the key thing here is that although there are some people that will just throw away their code and just start anew in Angular 2.0, I don't think that's going to be the most common thing that happens. The real migration path for most people is going to be taking the concepts of 2.0 and bringing them into your one app. So really there are going to be two steps. The first step being alignment, where you have your app and then you want to apply the concepts of 2.0, which really means the most important thing, creating a component-based system within your Angular 1 app. Isolating scope, doing all the things that Matthias talks about in his AirPair blog post. And then there's a whole bunch of additional stuff that you can start adding into your Angular 1 app that will bridge that gap. Some which, like Yuri talked about earlier, like ngNow. But also you can just start writing in ES6 will help, or TypeScript. You could use the component router like they talked about yesterday, and that'll help. Actually, some guys have even started to try to use the DI system in 2.0 in 1. I wouldn't necessarily suggest doing that, but you can do it. And there's going to be more of this that comes along. Then once you're sort of up to whatever your risk tolerance is for how far you have to go before you want to make that big jump, you can migrate. And if you want to, depending on your risk level, you could iterate in 1 up to the point where it's almost exactly the same. And it's just a small syntax exercise. So it's really up to your personal situation and what you want to do, but there is definitely a migration path. You know, saying that there is none is just not true. And if somebody does say that now, if you read that or whatever, they either are misinformed, don't know, or they're a troll. And so I want to finish the talk just on one last thing about trolls, because trolls aren't interested in the objective truth. They aren't interested in reality. They take small pieces of truth and then wrap it in their own agenda. So it sounds reasonable. It sounds like, yeah, that part sounds right, but you get veered off into this other direction. The best thing that you can do to avoid the influence of trolls is to get your hands dirty, try things out for yourself, and form your own opinions based off of your own experience. Don't just read stuff. Just try things out. So, in light of that, I want to leave you with some homework. If you haven't already tried Angular 2, like right today, you should be going to Angular.io, doing the 5-minute quick start, trying to get your hands dirty. Number 2 is the Ionic guys have started to put out there, and it's not official yet, but they have a website, learnangular2.com, with a couple simple examples. And it's only a couple things right now, but the idea, which I love, is to learn by example, to learn by trying just very simple pieces of code for the different parts of Angular 2. So try out the stuff that's there, and then as you learn, contribute. Add stuff back to this site so that other people can learn as well through examples. And then if you have questions, I mentioned earlier, the community wants to help. And right now, for Angular 2 at least, most of the help is on Gitter. So if you go to this URL for Gitter and ask any of your questions that you run into, you'll find more help than all the help you need. Thanks a lot, guys. I'm going to be in the back if you have any questions, and I have some t-shirts as well if anybody has any good questions for me. So thanks a lot.